So good morning, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me okay. I'm Doug Schmidt, and I'm here with my distinguished panel members. And we're going to be talking today about the gray zone. A panel titled, Entering the Gray Zone seems like it should be moderated by Rod Serling, but I'm the next best thing we have. So we're going to go first, having every one of the panelists briefly introduce themselves and talk about what gray zone means to them. But before we do that, just a little level setting. So looking around the room, I think it's fair to say that every one of us has grown up in the shadow of the Cold War, where we didn't experience clashes of armor on the steppes of Central Asia, but instead had something more like a variant of what Orwell called perpetual war, where people are having low-grade conflicts with various means pretty much all the time. And so what we're going to do now is have each of the panelists talk briefly about who they are and their perspective on what it means to have gray zone conflict. I'll start with Katherine.
Thank you for being here to listen to us talk about this. I'm happy to see one of my students in the room. I think maybe there should be more next time we do something like this. I am a Middle East person, comparative politics of the Middle East. Prior to 9/11, there were many more of us after 9/11 than before. In the aftermath of 9/11, I took on the issue of terrorism so that it wouldn't be taken on by someone who was not a Middle East specialist. And I came to Vanderbilt, where I began teaching about the Middle East, about political Islam, about terrorism, and was given the opportunity in a program that I think you may be familiar with, the Human Terrain Program, to go to Iraq with the military in 2008, 2009, as a social, and cultural, and political advisor to brigade commanders on the ground in Baghdad. And my focus, or my thinking about gray zone conflict, which I've been thinking about this all the time, but I never think of it in terms of gray zone conflict, because to be honest, it isn't very gray on the ground, is the sort of idea of a proxy, of support for proxy warfare, proxy militias, proxy armies, and in particular, of course, the master of this in the Middle East is Iran. Of course, Iran engages in many other types of gray zone conflict, shooting down drones, harassing shipping, assassination is a serious one that they engage in. It doesn't get as much press as these other areas. But for me, when I think of gray zone conflict, when I consider it, I think of Kataib Hezbollah and all of these militias operating in Iraq, operating in Lebanon, of course, classically Hezbollah, but also in Yemen and even in Afghanistan and Pakistan, that are supported by the Iranian government and that have become, over the years, I think, nobody could argue, increasingly aggressive. And we appear to be puzzled by how to respond to these militias. And that is sort of perhaps the focus of my thinking about gray zone conflict at this time. I will say that I just finished editing a textbook for undergraduates on the US military, and I don't think the word gray zone conflict is in the index, which is really problematic. Of course, it's very introductory, chapter on the Marines, chapter on the Navy, and yet I think that is indicative of two things that we should consider as we discuss. One is the U.S. military is not the only or the best American institution to respond to these kinds of conflicts, but also the U.S. military isn't thinking about this, or the people who are analysts of the military or members of the military aren't thinking about this as directly, perhaps, in terms of what it means for the development of our forces as they might be. I think that's changing, but it's something else to consider. And with that, I will turn it over to Sean McFate.
Well, thank you. And it's a pleasure to be at Vanderbilt, and a pleasure to talk to you. And Iran is a great case study of modern gray zone. I'm sure we'll get into that. Currently, I'm a professor at the National Defense University, which is a premier war college in Washington. Also, I'm at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service and Maxwell School. But before all that, I'm a fallen academic. Before all that, I was a former paratrooper, and then I became a private military contractor working in gray zone spaces around Africa and other places. And I saw things that made me, throw up, and decided to think deeply about it, and hence I came to academia to sort it out. And one of my intellectual mentors, who I didn't know at the time, was Bill Cafaro, who's here. He's a history professor at Vanderbilt, so it was a pleasure to meet him. He talks about, he might not agree with this, sort of gray zone warfare in the Middle Ages. Gray zone's not a new thing. The US has been doing it for a long time, but the problem is in the Washington establishment, strategic establishment, it's a buzzword in masquerading as a real idea. Why is it a buzzword? There's always buzzwords for this. In the 80s, it was called gray area conflict. Because in our modern conception of war, we think about modern war like pregnancy. You either are or you're not, right? It's either you're at peace. When peace fails, you declare war. When war succeeds, you go back to peace. It's enshrined in our laws of armed conflict. It's the paradigm of conventional war. It's the War of Clausewitz, Germany. It's World War I, World War II. This is the bedrock of our assumptions about what war is. So when we see things that are neither war nor peace, we get locked, not you, but DC gets locked in cognitive dissonance. And they don't want to call it war, but they know it's not peace. So they call it gray zone, or they call it some other buzzword. My favorite buzzword is the oxymoronic war beneath the threshold of war, right? That's a serious term. And of course, it's not going to be in a textbook because these are faddish terms, and they shouldn't be. I mean, you could call them under the umbrella of irregular warfare or conventional warfare, but beyond that, I would say we need to be more nuanced, not think about war versus peace, but war and peace, right? It's not war or peace, it's war and peace. And we need to end what our adversaries are doing today is they get right in between that space of war and peace in our minds, and they exploit it for victory, right? What they do is they wage war, but make it look like peace to us. So whether it's cyber attacks is a great example, right? Is that war, is that peace? I don't know. The former president of Estonia, she was like, well, you remember when Belarus weaponized refugees against Poland? Is that war, is that peace? We don't know. So I think war is becoming increasingly what we might call in the gray zone. In fact, I would totally reject this idea that there's conventional versus unconventional war. It's just conflict. And we need to become more nuanced thinkers and think around ambiguity. And right now, we need to create strategic leaders who are capable of that. And I don't see many, at least inside the Beltway. So I'm hoping Vanderbilt will produce them. Thank you.
I hate to disappoint you. I'm Andrew Coe. I'm a professor of political science at Vanderbilt. I spent the last few years increasingly devoted to studying the instruments of foreign policy that are arguably some of the main avenues of gray zone conflict. Things like using economic sanctions as an instrument for inciting attempts at regime change within the targeted countries. Things like sponsoring terrorist organizations as a way to preoccupy or undermine foreign regimes. It seems to me that I agree with my colleagues here that gray zone conflict has a very long history, certainly during the Cold War and before. But I think what's different now, or what's at least changing over time, is that it's always been the case that gray zone conflict was a way of trying to accomplish objectives that could be sought more directly through warfare, but at lower cost. And I think what we're seeing with the increasing importance of gray zone conflict is a response to the strengthening of the international community and its attempts to regulate and prevent outright warfare from happening. Russia using little green men in Ukraine before it invaded it outright was an attempt to get on the cheap what it could otherwise obtain through direct invasion and without inciting the same strong response from the international community. So I think we're going to see more of this, and not just by countries like Iran, but also countries like the United States, who also have incentives to try to avoid the increasingly high costs that come with engaging in direct warfare.
Thank you, Doug. I'm Peter Schram. I'm a professor here in the political science department. My research involves the organizational economics of terror and insurgent groups, as well as game theoretic models of low-level conflict. I'm an economist by training, so apologies for what that has done to me. So what drew me into this topic is that when I was conducting research on the Haqqani network, I had a Google alert set, and one of the articles that popped up was a particular incident, which was in 2009, there was a suicide attack on a forward operating base in Khost, Afghanistan. And this attack killed several US soldiers, several CIA officers, members of the Jordanian intelligence, and what the declassified intelligence report came out and said was this attack was perpetrated by the Haqqani network. It was funded by Pakistan's ISI, who had been meeting with the Haqqani network for months before the attack, and Pakistan's ISI gave $200,000 to the Haqqanis for doing this. Naturally, Pakistan denies its involvement in this sort of behavior, but it's fully consistent with Pakistan's support for militant groups within Iran, India and Afghanistan. So this drew me into, this topic of conflict between allies or conflict between states that aren't quite at war. Naturally, we prepared for this panel, and I was tasked with giving up a definition for gray zone conflict, which it seems we're maybe moving past the term, but I do think that there's some value to saying this is how we maybe should think about low-level conflict. And there's lots of definitions of gray zone conflict out there that can encompass an enormous set of behavior. But what I'd like to throw out to the audience is we should think about the low-level conflict that we're talking about on this panel as something that occurs when a militarily capable challenger intentionally is going to limit the intensity and capacity with which they conduct non-nuclear military operations. And then the defender who's incurring this, they're going to choose not to escalate to war. This definition, I think, is useful, and it's the reason I wanted to put it out there is we need to think about gray zone conflict not as an action, but this is an equilibrium. And in the most generic terms, what I'm trying to say is, given the rules of the international system, given the strategies that states bring to this is the best response. The challenger isn't escalating to war, and the defender isn't escalating either. And it's, this is what we're experiencing in the international today. How can we do better with this?
Great. So let's kind of shift the topic a little bit and talk about what are some of the motivations for actors, for states, for countries, and so on who engage in gray zone conflict. Is it viewed something that's mostly a boon for states that want to try to operate outside the accepted norms of the international community? Is it the least ineffective tool in their arsenal? What are the motivations for states to engage in this? We have some certain usual suspects that we've been mentioning so far, but obviously a range of different parties are playing this, and probably including us too, in the U.S. So do people want to talk about what some of the motivations are? Is it politics through other means?
I think part of the difficulty in defining it, and the reason why every generation of analysts use a slightly different buzzword to refer to it, is that that's by design. It's difficult to define precisely because if it was easy to draw a borderline around this is the set of activities we're going to call gray zone conflict or war below the threshold of war, or whatever we want to call it, then it would also be easy to create norms in the international community against doing it and punish states or other organizations for engaging in it. The whole point of these activities is that because they're ambiguous or opaque in some way, it's difficult to be crystal clear about who is responsible and that they have done something that violates the rules of the international community and should therefore be punished for it. So I think that's where the cloudiness of the concept comes from. It is a strategic response to a world that's increasingly proficient at enforcing a norm against aggression. And so the reason that most states engage in it, for me, is that they wish to avoid this international response. If you're Iran and you would like to see friendlier regimes brought to power in the Middle East, or at least you would like to see the current regimes in the Middle East that are hostile to you preoccupied with other problems rather than responding directly to you, the way to carry that out is to figure out a way to engage in conflict against them that isn't undeniably attributable to you, and thus that won't bring the West and everyone else into harsh actions against you.
I absolutely agree with all that. And I want to add a few elements that I've come to think of as important. And there's a quote, I think it's David Petraeus. He said, "This is Iran feeling out our edges, finding our edges. What will they take? What can they take? What can they not take? Let's learning about our enemy by at what point will they begin to respond? How will they respond?" So I think that is a goal that states that engage in gray zone conflict, and I think Putin also has done this with us. What will they take? And he learned perhaps the wrong lesson from that. But I also want to, as a sort of comparative politics and Middle East politics person, I have to send us to the domestic realm of states that use gray zone conflict. And again, I'll refer to Iran. I'm 100% confident that this is not just that the decision to take these actions is played out in a strategic game, not just with an external enemy, but within regimes where to be the primary decision maker or the developer of gray zone conflict or a leader of gray zone conflict is to rise up through the ranks of power within certain types of authoritarian states. And we saw this absolutely with the leader of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, Quds Force, the main arm of their sort of gray zone conflict, if you will, in terms of proxy support, Qasem Soleimani, who we recently assassinated. So there's a calculus that goes on with the enemy state, and there's an internal calculus that I think drives gray zone conflict today also, because the prestige of confronting a great power and getting away with it is incredibly meaningful inside of many of these regimes that choose to engage us in this way. And so, in a sense, unfortunately, what this means is that what we do to respond to it in terms of deterring it is not going to be the be-all and end-all of stopping it.
So I would agree that obviously politics, domestic especially, play a role, and I also agree that costs come into account. I would just add this, is that, gray zone, or whatever you want to call it, what it is, it's sneaky war, is what it is. It's sneaky warfare. And this is not a new concept. Sun Tzu, 2,500 years ago, says all war is deception. Our model for warfare, our paradigm, again, comes from the Clausewitzian mode of its kinetic firepower. And so we tend to view war as having to have an exchange of bullets. And this idea that you can achieve your war aims in a non-kinetic way, we call that gray zone or something like that. So, of course, the problem with gray zone is where's the limits? I mean, is Belt Road Initiative by China, is that gray zone because it has a national security? I mean, does everything become gray zone that doesn't involve bullets? That's a risk of this very, ambiguous definition. But we have to get away from the false dichotomy of war versus peace, army versus statecraft, et cetera.
Peter, do you want to add anything to that?
I mean, there's been so much great things that have already been said. I I mean, we need to think about this not just as a tool that states are doing, a tool that states are doing. They're doing this within the context of diplomatic means are failing, or they lack the economic clout to implement an effective sanctions regime, and they lack the ability to conduct an effective war. When we observed gray zone conflict, for example, in Ukraine, 2014 until very recently, this was viewed, to pick on the Beltway as well, this was viewed by many there as this is a sneaky, effective means of achieving policy goals. And what Russia's doing here is, n-dimensional chess. Instead, what that looked like over the long term was Russia started conducting these operations. As time went on, Ukraine got better and better at responding to them. And eventually it got to the point where Russia decided to switch. So gray zone isn't this, revolutionary idea. Sometimes these tools actually aren't necessarily that good. And when they get squeezed out of them, which can often happen, then we see resorting to other methods. So ultimately, we need to take a step back and say, yes, gray zone conflict is less cost, or whatever definition, gray zone conflict is less costly than war. And yes, there are these domestic perks to this. But in reality, it's debatable how effective these tools really are.
So Peter's answer is a good segue to our next topic. So I mentioned earlier that we've been living in the Cold War world for quite a long time, since we were kids. And so this has been with us for these kinds of conflicts, these low-grade conflicts and somewhat higher-grade conflicts from time to time have been with us for a long time. So the question for the panel next is gray zone conflict becoming more frequent? Is it becoming more frequent because we have social media, so we know a lot more than we used to? Is it becoming more damaging? Are we seeing more effects of gray zone conflict? Is it more important to think about? And if so, what are the reasons why? Is it because technology has changed? Is it because we have a global internet, the global web to provide consensus and consciousness about this? Is it because of geopolitical aims shifting? Is it because we're no longer in a dual hegemony world, but we now have a single country that's a superpower, and other people are trying to find other means because they can't compete head-to-head with the U.S. militarily? What do you guys think are some of the factors that are driving this?
I think technology can't be discounted. Gray zone conflict today looks very different than gray zone conflict looked in the age of exploration and piracy, when states would sponsor their favorite pirates to raid their enemies. But at the same time, war looks incredibly different today than it does since then. This idea that low-level conflict evolves, of course, conflict is evolving. Is it more frequent? Well, how we're measuring frequency is challenging, because now we have this new technology, cyber, where you can scale up these attacks and conduct so many of these attacks. So, to take a step back, the clearest thing we can say is gray zone conflict looks different today. It's changed today because the technologies for warfare and statecraft have changed.
I would jump in and add that there are a lot of ungoverned spaces at the moment, and those are great in terms of supporting proxy fighters and other kinds of areas. Of course, the seas are sort of semi-ungoverned space, one might argue, but that has allowed at least a certain kind of gray zone warfare to really flourish in those spaces since 2003, since 2011, at least in the areas I study.
Can I say that gray zone to me is really about, like I said, sneaky war, the art of deception. And the reason why modern warfare is becoming more gray, or whatever term I use, is because we live in an information age. And in an information age, information becomes the center of gravity in a way that 200 years ago, lethality was the center of gravity. So what we're seeing is that those who can play with information effectively, weaponize it, win. So, Iran has lots of examples of this, but a great case study is how Russia took Ukraine in 2014. Now, they could have blitzkrieged in with a conventional war, but they knew that was probably going to fail. We could talk about Ukraine today. Let's table that. But what they did is they used gray zone. They used weapons like Spetsnaz, special forces, mercenaries like the Wagner Group, Little Green Men, these astroturfed fake separatist militias in the East. These were all designed to give maximum plausibility on the battlefield. And meanwhile, their troll factory, the Internet Research Agency, was spewing out disinformation and creating the fog of war for these units to move through. And when policymakers and intelligence agencies in the West were still scratching their heads about what were the facts on the ground in East Ukraine, who was there and fighting and why, their Crimea was a fait accompli. And only then did Putin reveal what he had achieved, and only then did the tanks and the destroyers show up as symbols. That is the power of gray zone. It's not a lesser than, it's how you conquer today. And anybody who thinks that big armies and big militaries are how you still win, you need to explain to me why China is not deterred in the South China Sea despite our multiple carrier groups for a decade. You need to explain to me why our superlative military has not deterred Russia from going into Ukraine. My point is that way of warfare is obsolete. That's why Russia is losing today. It used an obsolete form of warfare called conventional war. Modern warfare is this type of gray zone or whatever we're talking about, and it's significant. And I'll end there. Thank you.
I know, so I guess I agree with that, but I sort of think, what we're seeing today in Ukraine is kind of the exception that proves the rule. There's a lot of discussion in why the West should be doing what it can to help Ukraine fight off the Russian invasion. That's oriented around the argument that doing this has consequences for the future of the international order because it sends a signal to every other state around the world that if you engage in outright aggression against a sovereign state, the international community will get together to impose harsh punishment on you and to thwart your aims, as the West is doing now to Russia. A consequence of that, an unintended side effect of that, is that every state watching this is also learning that, okay, if outright aggression is out of the question because of the united response from the world it will bring, then the only menu available to us are things that are not obviously outright conflict. And it's easy to be alarmist about that. It does, if you believe that theory, an implication of it is that we should see more gray zone conflict in the future because everybody starts making use of gray zone conflict where they would have previously actually invaded somebody. On the other hand, gray zone conflict is not as effective. And I don't.
As what?
My guess would be that if the U.S. government could snap its fingers and make all of these instruments of gray zone conflict go away for the whole world, they'd do it. But given that's not going to happen, now it's up to the United States to build the capabilities to compete in these avenues of conflict. And frankly, for me, there's no reason to think that the U.S. will be any less effective in gray zone conflict than it has been in conventional conflict.
Can I do a two-finger on that?
Please.
I think we have a hard time doing gray zone. We have a lot of history of it, right? But here's why. We're a democracy, right? We learned gray zone is about getting sneaky and secretive and using, kind of wily ways, right? So we know from the Church Committee that secrets and democracy are not compatible. So how do we engage in secret war? Like, how would we engage in warfare that Putin is engaging in, yet retain our democratic soul? And this is the question we should be asking in national security discourse, not how many F-35s or four-class carriers we need, but if war is indeed getting more sneaky. This is not a reaction to the last couple weeks. This has been going on since 1943, I'd say. 53. How do democracies fight this way without becoming autocracies in the process? Because autocracies can easily fight this way, but we cannot. So I'm not sure that we can easily, and I think that's one reason we're seeing the growth of autocracy, and we're seeing our Biden, like him or hate him, democracy versus autocracy. I think it's a real conundrum in our era.
I mean, it's odd to be a person who studies war professionally and yet be the optimist on the panel. But it seems to me that these are ultimately responses out of weakness. You resort to gray zone conflict because you're afraid of what will happen to you if you resorted to outright conflict. And so, I think the fundamental advantage the United States and its allies and friends bring to this kind of conflict is that ultimately most of the world is on the side of a peaceful international order, largely law-abiding. And we see this in the speed with which the world has turned against Russia. I mean, it's not uniform, not everyone agrees, it's not unanimous. But the bulk of the world's economic and military power has lined up alongside the United States and Ukraine against Russia. And the result is that in all likelihood, Russia's not going to be able to achieve its aims. It seems to me that that's a victory for the right side and a positive indicator of how the future will go.
Can I ask a question here? Just really quickly, so most gray zone conflict is actually not particularly sneaky, right? There's the whole disinformation world, and that is sneaky. But then, the proxy support is not very sneaky. I mean, they are very limited, interactions between some of these groups and their patrons. But we know who their patrons are, and we know who shoots down drones, and we know who's harassing tanks, and we know who's massing fishermen in the South China Sea. So we keep saying it's sneaky, but just an element of it is that there's plausible deniability. I'm not so sure about that, and I think that matters for our response. Should we also engage in it, or should we outright say, "You did that, and we are engaged"? And this is just simply low-level warfare, and sneakiness may be a part, but it's not as big a part maybe as we attribute it to it.
If you think Iranian soldiers were lobbing Katyusha rockets into northern Israel, it would be a different response from the world, or not?
Well, I don't think it should be a different response.
Would it be?
Yeah.
Let's leave the normative out of here.
I think it would be a different response, but I don't think I agree with that. I think that when we consider how we should respond to it, I think we are treating it too differently, and allowing it to be plausibly deniable. It's not plausible.
So do we have a question from the audience? Yeah.
Hello, I'm John Wixrow, and am moving into artificial intelligence and robot scientists. And in 2017, Stuart Russell, one of the fathers of artificial intelligence, produced a movie called, 8-minute movie called Slaughterbots that discussed the possibility of facial recognition, small drones with guns. And in the war in Libya, civil war in Libya, Turkish drones were used to destroy, to kill various troops. That is a form of gray zone that has not been addressed in this meeting yet, where you actually have a artificial intelligence system to design to do very subtle warfare, but not so subtle warfare. I'd like to hear you folks address that, if possible.
Yeah, that's actually, I was going to kind of park on that for a second too, the role of technology in all these different conflicts. So when I was I was a member of the Air Force Scientific Advisory Board about a decade ago, and we had the Chief of Staff of the Air Force come in, and we asked him, sir, what keeps you awake at night? And he said, it's not the threat of fifth-generation fighters coming from Russia or China. It's the threat of a half dozen people in a cyber cafe someplace taking down my network or taking down my defense systems. And so technology has changed a lot. AI and murder drones and all these kinds of things are great examples of that. We're starting to see those things being used quite widely now. What do you see that as far as the accelerant effect in the context of gray zone? Is this making it easier for asymmetric groups to be able to amplify and punch beyond their weight class? And how do you see that evolving?
I'm not sure why we're looking at me and not the war futurist here. But look, every form of conflict changes and evolves. We're using AI systems to conduct operations in Pakistan against militants. I don't see this as a particularly gray zone feature of gray zone. Maybe I'm misunderstanding the question.
I mean, the comment is it redefines the gray zone, I think, because a very small group could
start using, a very small group could basically either build or buy a murder bot. And so it, in some ways, democratizes, in the worst sense of the word, warfare. And I had a conversation with a BARDA official once, and I asked, how much chlorine could a drone carry over a stadium? And he says, that's not the question. The question is, how many drones could you fly over a stadium? So it basically says that the gray zone is being redefined by technology. And all the conversation I've been hearing so far is basically talking about current technology and not some very rapidly evolving artificial intelligence technology. And as an example, there was a paper in Nature Machine Intelligence in March about a study by a North Carolina drug design firm that changed its molecular design programs, artificial intelligence criteria from non-toxic to toxic. And the software invented 40,000 compounds on the range of toxicity. It had VX in the middle. So the point is that there are major changes coming from the technology, particularly artificial intelligence. And so we can talk about existing technologies and gray zone, but it appears to me the real threat is the emerging technologies and gray zone.
You know, part of the benefit of having multiple disciplines represented in the room is that when you get a panel of 4 social scientists who naturally mostly ignore the role of technology in the behavior we're seeing, our tendencies get corrected. So thank you for that.
If I could address that question. I mean, I don't think it's exactly gray zone, but the Venn diagrams overlap. So what we're seeing, whether it's that technology or, say, deep fake technology, right, which is getting increasingly easier to produce, cheaper to produce, and expensive to suppress and spot, right? And what it's doing is, you're right, it's democratizing warfare. And we tend to look at warfare as like this Napoleonic, who has the biggest military thing. You don't need that. I mean, the javelin has proven that maybe tanks are obsolete. Maybe big ships are obsolete. And the US Marine Corps is doing this right now. They get rid of all their tanks and all their attack helicopters and using things like this. And they're getting into more of what we consider gray zone, which is the big debate. But the point is that you also now open the aperture for non-states to engage in war in ways that we haven't seen in hundreds of years, and that will profoundly change who has power and the distribution of power in international relations. So I applaud that. Just emerging and disruptive technologies. And can we think beyond the paradigm of a state-centric world?
I mean, to continue the discussion, if you don't mind, there was a commentary on the web in one of the news organizations. After the UN failed to establish a resolution sponsored by or pushed by Russell
to start considering the banning of low explosive power drones, the comment was made that as the price of assassin drones drops, they're going to become the means of gang warfare. And so if you want to take out a gang member, you simply fly a drone over his house, and when he steps out the door, you assassinate him. So the Slaughterbots movie is extremely sobering, but by the same token, all of artificial intelligence could be switched from good to bad. And one needs to, I think the solution is design controls and to teach ethics to computer programmers.
So let's just take this a little bit step further and try to bring it back to the social science part without getting too caught up in the technology. But I think it's probably fair to say that technology, for example, nuclear weapons, have changed the way that we think about warfare. You don't think about massed armies fighting, again, in the steppes of Central Asia anymore. So technology, AI being one of the technologies, but I think more to the point, cyber-physical systems with intelligent sensors that can do what javelins do, fly over the tank, figure out where they're over the turret, explode then. These are really changing radically the way in which you can have asymmetric forces at work. So the question, not to focus on the technology part, but bring it back to the social part, how does that change the way that social organizations, states, to Sean's point, how do those things change over time to adapt to this? Because the threats can come from all kinds of different places now. They can come internally, groups that are dissentive can do things with weapons very quickly, be it gangs or other people with different agendas. How is that going to change the social dimensions of this and the political dimensions of this? When your adversaries don't stop at your borders, or don't start at your borders.
I mean, I do think that, we have the tools available to deal with this kind of problem. At one extreme, they're the kinds of tools that were used to deal with the problem posed by the spread of nuclear weapons, which is to say banning it, getting everyone else in the world with the ability to develop these things to agree to that, and then enforcing it over time. And you could conceive of the same thing happening for other weapon systems. I mean, it also happened for chemical weapons and for biological weapons. And those regimes aren't perfect, but they do, on net, reduce the risk humanity tolerates as a result of the invention of these weapons. And if it turns out that, at some point in the future, one can buy a murder drone, is it, or a slaughter bot? Fantastic names. I would buy that. If it turns out one can go to Walmart and buy that for $20 and use it against your neighbor who refuses to mow their lawn, then I'm guessing there will be strong public support for implementing these kinds of multilateral instruments to try to constrain the availability of these things, to raise the price states or non-state organizations have to pay to gain access to them. And I think in general, the evidence has been that this sort of thing is pretty successful. We have seen non-state organizations acquire weapons of mass destruction. The Japanese millennial organization Aum Shinrikyo developed its own nerve gas and released it in the Japanese subway. But the world learned we have to take that threat more seriously now. A lot of steps were taken to reduce the availability of these things, and we haven't seen more attacks like it since. So I'm astonished to be in the position of being the optimist here again. But those of you who know me know that that's really out of character. But I'm optimistic that to the extent that we see this threat actually rising and actual consequences occurring because of the easier and easier accessibility of these technologies, we will also see a political response to constrain that availability.
I think it's terrifying and very difficult as relates to chemical and biological, the combinations of those with other new delivery technologies. And those are going to take a kind of international consensus and all sorts of things. But I think in the cat and mouse game of defense, offense against new kinds of weapons, we learned a lot in Iraq and Afghanistan. And we learned we have to go faster. We learned we need to listen to people, soldiers on the ground. We need to get new ideas about how to counter things, and we need to and the Pentagon needs to move more quickly and be a lot fleeter, which they made efforts to do. Maybe those are kind of falling by the wayside now, to respond to these new threatening innovations quickly. And I think that we got sort of, if we're good on the international front, promoting the norms, and we do a little better, which we're on the path to, in terms of adjusting the bureaucracy to not have like a 10-year or 15-year delivery window for to counter a new threat, then that's also a heartening sign. However, the chemical and biological I don't think we're not there yet in terms of countering those threats.
Yes, sir.
So I would say I agree with the panel. I'm the director of the U.S. Army Chemical Biological Center at Everett Point. I agree with you, especially when it comes to convergence of technologies. I don't necessarily agree that we don't have some countermeasures. There are things that are out there that are bad, nasty, but we do have some countermeasures. We're working to get better. But I would like to hear some more about this kind of convergence of the threat, especially with new technologies. We're talking about drones, and we're talking about cybersecurity and things like that. Recently, about the past 2 years ago, some young investigators at Washington University inserted malware into a gene sequence. So when you read the gene on the DNA sequencer, you're inserting malware. And so these things are game changers in my mind. But I'd just be curious, in your thoughts about how these threats converge and how they become more insidious.
People are so smart. But so are we. I don't know. I don't know what else to say. I got a student right here who thinks about nothing but chemical warfare and biological warfare. She's going to go work this summer for the Department of Homeland Security. I can't, comment on the technology. All I can say is that, in the years I've been paying attention to this, and I know that Sean will have a lot to say about this too, but it's, we can't underestimate our enemies and what they're going to do, and we have to be vigilant, and we need to be more open to new ideas and messing around all the time and brainstorming what will they do next and constantly staying ahead of it. And I'm not 100% confident that we're bureaucratically prepared for that, and you probably have a lot more insight than I do on that. But I think we're better off than we were in 2001, for sure.
I think if you look at the attacks in Salisbury, those attacks, the attacks in Salisbury and the Novichok compounds,
Yeah.
and for a long time we thought that this would be, the game-changing event. We found out that actually we're more prepared than we thought.
Yeah.
And so I think even looking at Russia today, militarily we thought Russia and Ukraine would be this big monster. We find out that they're not as capable, their logistics, et cetera. And so I think as we look at these threats, I agree with you all 100%. The lower tier, the commercial off-the-shelf technologies that are being used are going to be very impactful. And we can't really predict, but we can prepare for surprise in a broader sense.
Good to hear.
So let's transition to a related but somewhat different topic. So we've talked a lot about the impact of gray zone and the implications of it and so on. From the panel's point of view, how serious should we be thinking about the threats of gray zone expansion versus traditional war? As Sean said, are conventional wars out of vogue? Has it seen its day? It's always dangerous to try to overgeneralize from what's happening at the moment, of course. But where do you see the biggest concerns be moving ahead?
Can I just start?
Yeah.
Because I know it'll stimulate a lot of conversation. I think conventional war is dead. It's the War of Westphalia. It's state-centric. It had a beginning, 1800, Napoleon, a middle, the Crimea War, the 1850s, and end, 45. Since then, if you look at conventional wars, you can count them on two hands. There's nothing more unconventional today than a conventional war. And if you look at the correlates of war, if you look at any other, any other database, it's pretty much clear about interstate conflict of this way. And that's also why it failed in, recently, this year. The last conventional war was in the 1980s with Iran, Iraq, and Falklands, maybe desert, Gulf One. But it doesn't deliver victory anymore, and that's why people don't use it. It's very expensive, your point about costs. There are cheaper and more efficient ways of winning. War is not a good word, but neither is competition or conflict, So I'll just start with that, is that warfare has evolved. It's no longer conventional. It's these other things because, organized violence has not waned in the last 70 years since 1945, but armed conflict has. So that, I'll just leave it there and bring it on. No, I'm just kidding.
I think, if you buy my earlier argument that it's a response to, that it's a way of trying to dodge an increasingly strong international response, then the increasing prevalence of gray zone conflict in the future is predicated on two background conditions. An international community that largely agrees on banning outright aggression in most cases and responding severely when it does occur, and a military backstop for that order that is a sort of ultimate guarantor that even if being sanctioned economically and outcasted diplomatically isn't enough to deter you, there's also an 800-pound gorilla in the world who will come and beat you up. So, I don't think we can read from the increasing prevalence of gray zone conflict that, for instance, the US and NATO should stop investing in conventional military capabilities. I think the prevalence of gray zone conflict is a response to the dominance of the US and its allies militarily.
Even though we haven't won a war since 45?
On the other hand, people haven't gotten away with nearly as much interstate aggression as they were doing before 1945 either.
It's hard to argue.
And I do think that's related to the strength of the United States and its allies.
I think there was the Cold War as well. So just taking this point a little bit further, we should really, that's not right. Apologies. Taking Andrew's point a little bit further, by viewing this world as saying, let's say that there's a world of peace, a world of more aggressive war, and a world of gray zone. We're not observing gray zone conflict everywhere in the world. We're not observing aggressive gray zone activity against NATO members. So to some extent, deterrence is functioning here. You know, there's this concern about escalation, which is why we're observing, you know, we observed what we observed in Ukraine 2014 to 2020, early 2022, and we weren't observing that in Germany. So, you know, it really is an open debate, and it's so glad, it's so great that we're having this debate, you know, how effective gray zone conflict actually is. I think in some cases, yes, it's absolutely what states need to do because they can't compete at the higher levels. On other hands, you know, you're saying the United States can't keep secrets, it's not as good as gray zone conflict. Well, to some extent, maybe it doesn't need to be because it's a democracy, because it's an economic powerhouse. It can turn to these other policy levers in such a way that it doesn't need to, you know, worry too much about sending troll farms in to bug Russian elections.
I think it's also worth pointing out we've been trying very hard to keep the Ukraine stuff out of our panel for obvious reasons, because that's going to be focus of other things. But I would just caution not to overgeneralize from Russia's ineffectiveness in the current conflict to other opportunities for conventional war. There's China and Taiwan, which could quickly escalate, which would be hopefully won't happen, but if it does happen, I hope it would be a conventional war. But you can imagine there's a few other places in the world where those things could still happen. So I think that's, to Peter's point, we don't want to start, you know, divesting in our ability to respond in those environments, because I think war still exists as potential, and perhaps it's the deterrent effect that keeps it from escalating more. But let's turn, as the last topic, to deterrence. What are things that we can be thinking about doing as an international community, as the United States, as academics, as other people in these ecosystems, to try to help deter, where possible, gray zone conflict, or at least to ameliorate it to a point where it's not as lethal?
As an academic, let me just say this is a really tricky topic because we're dealing with multiple levels of conflict where there's linkages between the technologies. So a technology that, you know, a cyber attack that could be great for gray zone conflict could also be helpful for a conventional war. Or building out a coast guard is a way to deter against Chinese gray zone activities in the South China Sea. That coast guard may not be as effective in conducting conventional war, and that can incentivize China to behave in different ways. So focusing on this topic of deterrence, deterring in the gray zone, it's a slippery proposition. In the simplest state of the world, we can think about dyads in the international system as being in 3 states. Some more traditional form of war, maybe not Napoleonic wars, but more like Iran, Iraq, or, you know, Ukraine today. War, peace, gray zone. If we start competing in the gray zone, one of those options is gone. And the end result could be peace, but it could also be an escalation.
I agree with what Peter said about the complexity of this. And I've just been thinking about this a lot ever since January 2020, really, with the assassination of Qasem Soleimani. And other things too, particularly Iran's recent rocket attacks on the Kurdistan regional government. And the Biden administration initially sort of said, well, to the Kurds, well, you figure out who did this. Everybody knew who did it. I think that we need to, that being sort of first with the truth is an important kind of deterrence of for gray zone conflicts of this type. Let's not play this game. Let's say, you did it. Let's lower the bar for attribution to where we don't have to have, you know, a huge preponderance of evidence to show. Let's get out there immediately after it happens and say, you did it. Now, what will this achieve? It just makes the it makes the gray zone a little costlier to act in. And if that's what, one of the few things that we can do, then let's do it. Well, now what this gets problematic is when we are operating in the gray zone and we don't want to attribute the things that we do. And so as I've been thinking about this, I've been feeling, let's respond to gray zone activities against us very directly, very immediately, and very openly, and let's not ourselves go down that route as much as our adversaries have done, in the hopes of establishing some form of deterrence or depriving people of some of states of some of the benefits of these activities.
We have about a minute left, so Andrew and Sean, you guys want to have the last word?
30 seconds, 30 seconds.
Okay. I could sort of imagine two paths the United States could go down, and which path we end up choosing, and part of the confusion we have today is that we don't see yet which path is appropriate. In one path, we imagine, it turns out the alarmists are right, and these new modes of conflict that are emerging for technological reasons are modes where the US cannot become dominant in the way it is in conventional military technologies. And so we pursue the path of trying to undermine plausible deniability, of trying to ban the most dangerous of the technologies and constrain their availability to other countries, and all the things that would go with that. And the other path I can imagine is that the US spends some of its immense resources on developing its own capabilities in these new modes of gray zone conflict. It learns over time that it turns out US cyber warfare is just as good relative to its likely enemies as US conventional warfare is. And so we don't want to ban this because this actually adds to our strength instead of subtracting it. And we don't do a whole lot to constrain these things because they actually, over time, make the US stronger. I think the difficulty we face today is that we're not sure which of those is going to end up being true yet. But I think we will learn a lot as a result of the war that shall not be mentioned in this panel. And I think we'll learn a lot from the next few conflicts in which gray zone plays a larger role.
Sean, you get the last word.
All right, quickly. I think conventional war deterrence is obsolete. It doesn't work in the South China Sea or in the war that shall not be named today. It hasn't worked really anywhere. I mean, and nuclear deterrence is not conventional. Second, I do believe that your strategy of creating implausible deniability is necessary but not sufficient to beat this back. And here's where I might just diverge from my colleagues. I think as war becomes more like this, the US needs to get into the shadows and punch back. That's how you cause costs. But we have this democracy problem that is a discourse we have to have. And lastly, to your point, is all this modern technology and geopolitics, I am seeing the sort of the liberal world order fraying. Mid-century, we might be in a place where not all the superpowers are states. And how will that change everything? And I think that's part of this larger tale.
Super. Well, we are done. Thank you guys all so much. Thanks for my panelists. We appreciate your time.
Thank you.